You think that patch means something, old man? The voice came sharp as broken glass across the steel and fluorescent hush of the Delta mess hall, cutting through the low murmur of lunch trays and coffee spoons. Staff Sergeant Cole Mercer stood with the easy arrogance of a man who had never doubted his place in the world, broad shoulders filling the aisle, sleeves tight against forearms marked by fresh ink and younger wars. Across from him sat Elias Mercer, 82 years old, shoulders bowed not in weakness but in age-earned economy, a quiet old man in a weathered brown field jacket, his hands wrapped around a chipped white mug gone cold 10 minutes earlier. On the inside of his wrist, where his sleeve had slipped back, rested a faded black symbol no one at the table recognized, a circle split by a narrow spear line. It looked old. It looked almost hand-burned into skin, and it made Cole grin. Around him, 2 Delta operators leaned in, amused, sensing sport. Looks like something from a surplus bin outside Fayetteville, one muttered, drawing laughter. Elias said nothing. That silence unsettled them more than protest would have. The overhead fluorescent lights cast a pale military glare over stainless counters and polished concrete floors. But in the old man's pale blue eyes there was another kind of light, distant and colder, as if he were watching weather roll in over another lifetime. Cole mistook it for weakness. He set his tray down with a hard metallic slap. "Come on, old-timer," he said louder, drawing glances from half the room. "Don't tell me you're wearing some secret unit symbol hoping somebody salutes." A few chuckles rose. Someone in the back stopped eating. Even among hard men, there was something about humiliating an old veteran in public that bent the air wrong. Elias lifted the mug and took a slow sip. "It's just a mark," he said, voice rough as gravel under tires. No defense. No explanation. That made Cole press harder. Arrogance always mistakes restraint for surrender. "A mark?" he echoed. "Looks fake to me." He leaned closer, finger hovering near the symbol. "Never seen it in regiment archives. Never seen it in JSOC history. Means it. Means nothing." At the next table, Sergeant Luis Reyes looked up from black coffee and froze almost imperceptibly. He had seen old combat veterans before. He knew the ones who talked too much. This one had the opposite problem. The kind who carried silence like a weapon. Elias set the mug down. The ceramic click against metal echoed strangely loud. "There are things not kept in archives," he said. Simple words. No bravado. Yet something in the room tightened. Cole smirked and, making the mistake history always gives the proud, reached out and touched the faded symbol with one careless knuckle. For the briefest instant, Elias's face changed. Not anger, not fear, but the shadow of memory crossing old terrain. Reyes saw it and felt a cold pulse crawl up his spine. The laughter around the table thinned. Even the HVAC hum seemed louder now. Cole drew back, still smiling, unaware he had stepped onto something older than rank. "Tell me what secret club this belonged to," he said. Elias looked past him, through him almost, toward the rain-streaked windows beyond the mess hall. "The kind that didn't come home whole," he said quietly. No one laughed after that. Across the room, a young specialist pretending to refill coffee had stopped moving entirely. Reyes slowly reached into his pocket beneath the table, fingers closing around his phone. He did not know why his pulse had picked up, only that something was wrong, or perhaps something buried had just begun to move. Reyes did not place the call right away. His thumb hovered over the dark screen as he watched the old man return to silence, as if the words he had spoken had cost him something heavier than breath. Around the mess hall, conversations tried to resume, but they returned in fragments, broken and uneasy. The confidence had drained from Cole Mercer's grin, though pride kept him standing there. He folded his arms and forced a laugh meant more for the room than himself. "Sounds dramatic," he said, but the edge had dulled. Elias did not answer. Instead he drew one weathered finger slowly across the rim of his coffee mug, a small absent motion, almost ritual. Reyes recognized it without knowing why, the way old pilots touched a dashboard before takeoff, the way men revisited ghosts through habits. He rose from his chair and crossed the aisle with careful casualness, boots muted against concrete. "Sir," he said to Elias, voice respectful in a way the others noticed immediately. "Mind if I ask where you served?" Cole turned sharply. "Reyes, what are you doing?" But Reyes ignored him. Elias lifted his eyes. There was no offense there, only a long measure of a younger man trying to decide whether truth was owed. "Places not on maps anymore," he said. The answer landed strangely in the fluorescent hum. One of the operators scoffed, but weakly. Cole stepped in again, unwilling to let control drift. "That symbol," he said, pointing now but no longer touching. "If it means so much, why has nobody in this room seen it?" Elias looked toward the mess hall windows where light rain streaked the glass in silver threads. For a second the old man seemed far from Fort Liberty, far from polished floors and digital access doors. Because the people meant to recognize it are mostly gone. The room went still enough for the ice machine to sound loud. Reyes felt a chill under his collar. He stepped back, pulled out his phone, and without asking permission typed a secure message to an old contact at command support. One line only. "Do records exist for a black circle split by a spear line symbol? Possible retired operator named Elias Mercer." He hit send. Across from him, Cole had begun circling verbally, searching for dominance. "You know," he said, "guys who invent legends usually want an audience." Elias gave the faintest smile, almost sad. "And men who mock symbols usually do not know what they are stepping on." It was not a threat. That made it heavier. Cole opened his mouth to fire back when Reyes's phone vibrated in his palm. Response incoming. He glanced down. One sentence. "Call me now." Immediate. No signature, only a secure command prefix. His heartbeat stumbled. He moved toward the far wall beneath the framed campaign photos and made the call. A clipped voice answered before the second ring. "Where did you see that symbol?" Reyes described the old man, the wrist mark, the name. Silence. Followed. Not casual silence. Weighted silence. The kind before orders. Then the voice lower now. "Do not let him leave." Reyes stared across the mess hall at Elias, who sat exactly as before, as if none of this touched him. "Who is he?" Reyes whispered. Papers rustled faintly over the line. Then came the reply that hollowed the air around him. "Stay where you are. Brigadier General Nathan Thorne has been notified." Reyes looked up just as Cole, still trying to recover the room, laughed and said to the others, "Maybe next he will tell us he trained ghosts." Elias slowly turned his wrist, letting the faded symbol catch the sterile overhead light. And for the first time, something in his pale eyes looked not tired, but watchful. The laughter around Cole Mercer faded under its own weight, collapsing into the uneasy quiet that settles before a storm no one sees coming. Reyes lowered the phone slowly, every instinct telling him he had crossed into a place ordinary protocol did not reach. Brigadier General Nathan Thorne had been notified. Even thinking the name sent a cold line through his spine. Across the room, Elias Mercer sat unchanged, one old hand around the coffee mug, the other resting near the faded symbol as if it had become an anchor dropped into deep water. Cole sensed the room slipping from his control and pushed harder, because pride often grows loudest when it begins to fail. "You hear that?" he called to the operators nearby. Now command is involved over an old tattoo and a ghost story. A few forced smiles answered him, but none carried conviction. Elias looked at him for a long moment, not with irritation, but with the patience of a man who had seen younger men mistake noise for authority before. "It is not a tattoo," he said quietly. "It is a promise." The words landed with strange gravity. Cole stepped closer. "A promise to who?" Elias did not answer at first. His thumb traced once across the symbol, and in that small movement something in his face shifted, not enough for most men to notice, but Reyes saw it. The old fluorescent light dissolved in Elias's eyes into something older, a memory moving behind them. Rain against the mess hall windows became another rain in another decade. The smell of coffee seemed replaced for an instant by wet earth and aviation fuel. His voice came low, almost to himself. 5 men wore it once. Cole scoffed. "And what happened to them?" Elias turned his gaze back. For came home. Silence followed, so complete the rattle of trays from the far serving line sounded distant. Even Cole did not answer immediately. Reyes felt the hairs rise on his arms. His secure phone vibrated again. New message. ETA 7 minutes. Hold position. He slipped the phone away and looked toward the entrance doors, half expecting the world to remain ordinary despite what was building. But the air had changed. Even the younger specialists lingering near the coffee station sensed it. One by one they stopped pretending not to watch. Cole folded his arms tighter. Convenient story, he muttered. No records, no proof, just mythology. Elias gave the faintest nod, almost in agreement. The things worth carrying are rarely written down. Then, to everyone's surprise, he pushed back his sleeve another inch. More of the symbol showed old black lines worn soft with age. And beneath it, almost hidden, were tiny initials burned into the design. N.T. Reyes saw them first. His breath caught. Nathan Thorne. Before he could speak, the overhead speakers cracked alive with a brief burst of static. Not an alarm. Worse, administrative override tone. Every active duty head in the mess hall lifted instinctively. A clipped voice from base operations came through. Attention Delta personnel. Maintain current positions. No explanation. Just that. The operators stared at each other. Cole's confidence faltered visibly now. What the hell is this? He whispered, not to anyone in particular. Elias only looked down at his coffee, as calm as if waiting for a bus. Then, beyond the rain-streaked windows, Reyes saw black staff vehicles roll past the motor pool at speed, tires hissing on wet pavement. No sirens, no lights, which somehow made it heavier. The old man finally lifted his eyes once more to Cole and said in almost a whisper, "You asked who the promise was to." He let the words hang. Then he looked toward the entrance doors. "You are about to meet him." No one moved when Elias said it. The words seemed to suspend the room in a held breath, as if even the fluorescent lights hummed softer, waiting for something older than protocol to arrive. Outside, rain traced silver threads down the mess hall windows while black staff vehicles came to a stop beyond the motor pool. Dark shapes under a slate Carolina sky. Cole Mercer looked toward the doors, jaw tightening, still unwilling to surrender certainty. "This is theater," he muttered, though he no longer sounded convinced. Reyes said nothing. His pulse was too loud in his ears. Then Elias, still seated, lifted his gaze toward the rain and for the first time began speaking, not to defend himself, but as though a gate inside memory had quietly opened. "We were 5, he said. Not a unit anyone saluted. Not a patch anyone wore in daylight." The room leaned into the silence around him. Even Cole did not interrupt. Elias's fingers rested on the symbol, and his voice carried the weight of distance. There was a night when the moon gave no light and maps ended at a ridgeline no one admitted existed. We carried no insignia, no names on uniforms. Only this mark burned into skin, so if one man vanished, another would remember he had been real. His eyes did not blink. Somewhere in the room a tray set down too hard made a hollow metallic note, but no one turned. They were somewhere else now. "One of us was young," Elias continued. "Too certain, too fast. Thought skill could outrun consequence." A faint ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Nathan Thorne. At the name, Reyes felt his stomach tighten. Cole stared, all mockery drained. Elias looked not at them, but through decades. There came fog so thick the world shrank to 5 feet. Radios failed. Compass needles wandered. Men learn what they are in silence like that. His voice lowered. That was where the promise was made. The symbol on his wrist seemed darker under the overhead glare. No man left unseen. No debt left unpaid. The mess hall had become so quiet the rain itself sounded like whispered static. Cole finally spoke, but softer now. "You expect us to believe a general carried that mark." Elias turned his wrist fully, letting the tiny initials catch light again. He carved his own. Before anyone answered, the outer doors opened. Not dramatically. No crash, no command bark. Just a slow hydraulic sigh. Two aides entered first, not speaking, stepping aside almost at once. Then Brigadier General Nathan Thorne crossed the threshold. The room reacted before thought. Men who had laughed moments earlier straightened by instinct. Chairs scraped, boots planted. But Thorne did not look at them. He did not acknowledge rank or protocol or the startled operators frozen in half-salute confusion. His eyes went only to Elias. And then something happened none of them expected. The general stopped walking. Completely. As though the sight before him had struck harder than any shouted order. For several long seconds he said nothing. Cole Mercer felt his mouth go dry. Reyes had never seen a commander go motionless like that. It was not hesitation. It was recognition too heavy for speech. Slowly, almost reverently, Nathan Thorne approached the old man's table. Elias did not rise. He simply looked up at him with the calm of one greeting whether long expected. Thorne's jaw tightened once. Then, without a word, he rolled back his sleeve. Gasps moved through the room. Burned faint with age on his forearm lay the same black symbol split by a spear line. Identical. Shared. The room seemed to lose oxygen. Cole took a half-step backward. Nathan Thorne looked at Elias, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. You kept the promise. No one in the mess hall seemed to breathe after those words. You kept the promise. They settled over steel tables and polished concrete with more force than a shouted command ever could. Brigadier General Nathan Thorne did not raise his voice, did not explain himself, did not turn this into spectacle. That silence itself became authority. Elias Mercer looked up at him with a faint expression almost too small to call a smile. I figured one of us should, he said. A few Delta operators exchanged stunned glances, as if trying to reconcile the old man with the reality standing before them. Cole Mercer stood, rooted in place, every ounce of swagger stripped away by something far worse than public correction. Recognition. Thorne lowered himself into the empty chair across from Elias, ignoring aides hovering uncertainly at the edge of the room. The act alone unsettled everyone more. Generals did not sit in chow halls with forgotten old men unless history had just entered the room. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere in the kitchen a dishwasher whined and shut off. Even the bass seemed to pause. Nathan Thorne looked at the faded symbol on Elias's wrist and shook his head once in quiet disbelief. 43 years, he murmured. And you still wear it. Elias shrugged almost imperceptibly. Some things do not come off. Reyes watched, feeling as though he had stumbled into classified memory made flesh. Then Thorne did something no one expected. He turned his forearm over so the old mark caught the fluorescent light, then placed it beside Elias's on the table. Two matching symbols, aged decades apart, touching polished steel. It looked less like proof than covenant. Murmurs moved through the room. One young specialist near the coffee line whispered a prayer under his breath. Cole swallowed hard. Sir, he managed, voice rough. I did not know. Nathan Thorne did not look at him immediately. He kept his gaze on Elias and said softly, that was the point. Then at last he turned. The room tightened. Everyone expected reprimand. It did not come. Staff Sergeant Mercer, the general said, calm as winter air. What did you see when you looked at this man? Cole's mouth opened, then failed him. An old civilian, sir. Thorne nodded once. Exactly. He let the words hang until discomfort deepened into understanding. And that is how history disappears. No anger, no humiliation, only judgment sharpened by truth. Cole lowered his eyes. For the first time since the confrontation began, he looked young. Elias studied him for a moment, then surprised everyone by speaking before the general could continue. He is not the first to mistake silence for weakness. Cole looked up, startled. There was no bitterness in the old veteran's face. Only weary mercy. Thorne exhaled. Through his nose, almost amused. He has always been kinder than he should be. Reyes felt tension leave his shoulders in a rush. But the room was not finished changing. An aide stepped close to Thorne and whispered something urgent. The general listened, then waved him off. It can wait. He turned back to Elias. You disappeared after Honduras. Several heads lifted at the name. Elias looked toward the rain again. I was never meant to be found. Thorn leaned back slowly, studying him. And yet here you are, in my mess hall, letting operators mock the mark. Elias's eyes narrowed with old humor. I wanted to see if the new generation still looked beyond uniforms. A few embarrassed smiles flickered around the room. Even Reyes nearly laughed. Then Thorn stood. Every instinct in the hall stiffened with him. But instead of issuing orders, he took one measured step back from the table, brought himself to full attention, and rendered a salute so sharp and unforced it seemed to split the ears open. The entire room froze, and one by one, without command, Delta operators began rising to do the same. The salute held the room in a silence so complete it seemed even the rain outside had stopped to witness it. Brigadier General Nathan Thorn did not lower his hand until every Delta operator in the mess hall stood at attention. Some rigid with instinct, others shaken by emotion they had not expected to feel over lunch trays and fluorescent light. Cole Mercer rose last. His movement was slower, almost reverent, as if each inch carried the weight of his earlier laughter. Elias Mercer remained seated through it all, looking not triumphant but faintly burdened, as though public honor sat heavier on him than hardship ever had. When Thorn finally lowered his salute, no one moved. Then, in a voice quieter than command but stronger than any order, he said, "Do you know why men like him vanish into ordinary life?" No one answered. Even the aides at the doorway seemed afraid to disturb the question. Thorn turned slowly, letting his gaze pass across the operators. Because some service was never meant to become legend. His words settled deep. He looked back at Elias. And, because some men do not confuse remembrance with recognition. Reyes felt those words land harder than any briefing he had ever sat through. Around him younger operators who had entered the room expecting routine now stood as if in chapel. Cole lowered his hand and stepped forward, hesitation visible in every movement. "Sir," he said to Elias, voice stripped of bravado, "I owe you an apology." Elias looked up and for a moment said nothing. Then he motioned faintly toward the empty chair beside him. "Sit." Cole blinked, startled. "Sir." "Sit down, son." The word son seemed to break something loose in the young operator's expression. He obeyed. The sight of a Delta operator sitting shoulder to shoulder with the old man he had mocked minutes earlier carried its own quiet reversal. Thorn remained standing beside them, almost protective without appearing so. "You asked what the symbol meant," Elias said, folding his weathered hands. "It meant if one man was hunted, another came back for him, no matter the cost, no matter the years." Cole listened with the fixed attention of a student hearing history breathe. "And you kept that for 4 decades?" he asked. Elias nodded. Promises age slower than flesh. A few men in the room looked away then, hiding emotion they had not prepared for. Reyes noticed one hardened senior sergeant wipe a thumb discreetly along his jaw. Thorn rested a hand lightly on the back of Elias's chair. "He carried me out through jungle fog when I was too arrogant to know fear," he said. The general almost smiled at the irony. Today he let arrogance test itself again. Soft laughter moved through the room, easing something tight. Even Cole managed a humbled exhale. But the moment sharpened again when Thorn looked toward the wall where unit honors hung framed beneath glass. "Most men in this room think honor comes after action," he said. "Sometimes it comes in how you treat a quiet stranger before knowing who he is." That sentence struck harder than any reprimand could have. Cole looked at Elias and this time held the gaze. "I saw only an old man," Elias answered gently. "Then today you learned to look twice." Outside, thunder rolled faintly. Beyond the motor pool, the afternoon light dimmed to steel blue through the windows. An aide approached again, murmuring that command staff were waiting. Thorn ignored him once more. Instead he reached into his breast pocket and removed a worn challenge coin darkened by decades. He placed it before Elias on the metal table. Reyes leaned forward unconsciously. Thorn said, "I have carried this since that ridge." Elias stared at it a long moment, then looked up with something like pain softened by gratitude. "I thought you lost it." Thorn shook his head. "No, I was waiting to return it." The old veteran picked up the coin, thumb tracing its edge, and for the first time his hand trembled. Not from age, from memory. Then he whispered, almost too low to hear, "For came home." Thorn answered, and the fifth just walked back into the room. For several long seconds, no one spoke after those words. The challenge coin rested in Elias Mercer's palm like a small piece of recovered time, and every man in the mess hall seemed to understand they were standing inside something far older than military ceremony. Rain moved softer now against the windows, and the late Carolina light had turned gray-blue, casting the room in the muted color of memory. Elias turned the coin over once, thumb brushing its worn edge, then closed his fingers around it as though sealing a promise not broken but renewed. Brigadier General Nathan Thorn watched him with an expression none of the younger operators had ever seen on a commander's face. Not command, not calculation, gratitude. Cole Mercer sat very still beside the old veteran, no longer carrying the posture of a challenger but of a man listening for truths he had spent years too hurried to notice. Then Thorn spoke again, his voice low enough that the room leaned toward it. "There is something they do not know." His eyes moved toward the operators. "About why this symbol was never recorded." The silence sharpened. Even Reyes felt anticipation tighten in his chest. Elias exhaled slowly, almost reluctant. "Nathan." A warning in the name. Thorn gave a faint smile. "It is time." He turned and looked toward the framed unit honors on the wall, then back to the room. The mission he spoke of was never declassified. It does not exist in any museum, any history, any citation. A young sergeant near the coffee line whispered, "Then how are we hearing this?" Thorn answered without looking away from Elias. "Because one of the men who made it possible is sitting at this table." No one moved. Cole's face had gone pale beneath the fluorescent light. "Sir," he said carefully, "what happened on that ridge?" Elias stared at the challenge coin as though deciding whether Old Ghost should be named. Then he spoke. "The fog closed in before dawn. We were separated. Nathan was the youngest among us. Thought he could outrun terrain." A few men smiled faintly at that. Even Thorn dipped his head in quiet admission. The extraction point shifted. We had one path left. Elias looked up. And one man had to go back. He said nothing more. He did not need to. The room filled the silence with its own imagination, and somehow that made it heavier. Thorn added only, "Without him, none of us wear uniforms now." That sentence landed like a bell toll. Cole lowered his eyes. "And I laughed at his symbol." Elias surprised him again. "Then perhaps you were meant to." Cole looked up, confused. Elias's pale eyes softened. "Because respect learned without discomfort rarely lasts." Reyes would remember that sentence for the rest of his life. Then Thorn did something no one expected a second time. He stepped aside from the table and addressed the operators not as a commander but almost as witness. "Every class that rotates through this unit studies tactics, endurance, discipline. But none are taught how humility keeps warriors from becoming blind." His gaze rested on Cole. "Today you received that lesson. No one mistook it for rebuke. It was inheritance." At that moment, an old civilian maintenance worker entered through the far kitchen doors carrying a mop bucket, froze at the sight of generals and operators standing in reverent silence, and began awkwardly backing out. Elias called softly, "Frank." The man stopped. "Come here." He approached uncertainly. Elias held up the challenge coin. "Remember telling me I should throw old junk away?" Frank laughed nervously. "Yes, sir." Elias placed the coin in his hand. "Looks like I was wrong." Even hardened operators smiled then. The room breathed again. But before the warmth could settle, a secure radio on an aide's belt crackled sharply. The aide stiffened, listened, then leaned toward Thorn with urgency. Something changed in the general's face. Not alarm. Recognition. He turned slowly back to Elias and said, almost with disbelief, "There is one more person coming." Elias frowned. "That is impossible." Thorn's reply was barely above a whisper. "That is what I thought too." The words "there is one more person coming" seemed impossible enough to stop even breath itself. Elias Mercer stared at Nathan Thorn as though the general had spoken from some impossible seam in time. "No," Elias said quietly, almost to himself. "There were only 5. Thorn did not answer. His eyes had shifted toward the entrance doors again, and whatever he was seeing in memory had hollowed his expression into something younger and more vulnerable. The room felt smaller now, compressed by anticipation no one could name. Even the operators who moments earlier had begun to relax stood rigid once more. Rain whispered against the glass, and beyond it headlights cut through the wet afternoon like pale blades. A black sedan rolled to a stop. Then another. The hydraulic doors sighed open. No one entered at first. Only the sound of boots approaching over concrete outside, measured and unhurried. Cole Mercer leaned forward unconsciously, hands clasped so tight his knuckles whitened. Reyes felt his pulse in his throat. Then an old man stepped through the doorway. Taller than Elias, though stooped with age, wearing a weathered olive-field coat older than some men in the room. Silver hair cropped close, one hand resting lightly on a wooden cane polished smooth by decades. He paused beneath the fluorescent light and looked over the mess hall with pale gray eyes that seemed to miss nothing. For a long second no one moved. Then Elias rose from his chair so abruptly the metal legs scraped loud against concrete. The sound shocked the room. It was the first time anyone had seen him move with urgency. The old man at the door stared back. His lips parted slightly. Eli, the name carried 40 years in a single syllable. Elias took one step forward, then another, as though not trusting his own sight. "Tom Keegan," he whispered. The name passed through the room like current. Nathan Thorn closed his eyes once, almost in disbelief, then gave a broken half-laugh none had ever heard from him. "The 5th man," he said. Some of the operators looked between them as if witnessing a myth refuse to stay buried. Tom Keegan moved closer, cane tapping softly. "I heard someone flash the old mark on a military base and frightened half a command chain," he said, dry humor roughening his voice. A stunned ripple of laughter broke the tension. Elias reached him, and for several seconds the two old men only looked at one another, not speaking, measuring decades lost. Then Tom lifted his sleeve. The same faded symbol. A murmur rose through the room. 3 living marks now beneath one roof. Cole Mercer seemed unable to blink. "Sir," he whispered to no one. "This cannot be real," Reyes answered under his breath. "It is more real than anything we have trained for today." Tom turned toward the operators, eyes settling on Cole. "Which one laughed at the symbol?" Cole straightened as if under inspection. "I did, sir." Tom studied him, then nodded. "Good." Cole looked bewildered. Tom smiled faintly. "Means you still had something to learn." Even Elias let out a low laugh at that. Nathan Thorn stepped beside the 2 old veterans, and for a moment the 3 of them stood in a quiet triangle history had not intended anyone else to see. Then Tom reached into his coat and withdrew a folded yellowed paper worn soft at the creases. He handed it to Elias. "Kept this for you." Elias unfolded it slowly. His hand trembled. It was a mission photo, grainy and faded. 5 young men standing under rotor wash, faces hard with youth. The room leaned in. On the back, in black ink weathered but legible, were words written long ago. "If one returns, all return." Elias looked up, eyes bright now with something beyond memory. Nathan Thorn saw it too. Without command, without ceremony, he stepped back and came to attention again. This time every operator in the mess hall moved with him before thought. And as 3 old veterans stood beneath sterile base lights like ghosts returned, even Cole Mercer understood he had not witnessed a correction of arrogance. He had witnessed legacy walk back through a door. The salutes held for several seconds, then slowly lowered, but something in the room did not return to what it had been before. It had crossed some invisible threshold. The rain outside had softened to mist, and the last of the afternoon light gave way to a quiet blue dusk through the mess hall windows. No one rushed for phones. No one broke the moment with nervous talk. Even the aides at the doorway stood still, understanding they had become witnesses rather than participants. Elias Mercer looked down once more at the old mission photo in his hands, the 5 young faces frozen beneath rotor wash, and something in his expression seemed to release a burden carried too long. Tom Keegan rested his cane against the table and leaned in. "You still keep terrible coffee," he muttered. Elias gave a laugh so low and genuine it startled the room. Nathan Thorne smiled openly now, decades seeming to fall from his face. Around them Delta operators remained standing, not from protocol anymore, but from instinctive respect. Cole Mercer stepped forward slowly. He no longer looked like the man who had mocked an old symbol over lunch. He looked like a man altered by a single afternoon. "Sir," he said to Elias, then paused, correcting himself. "Elias, may I ask one thing?" Elias nodded. Cole glanced at the symbol. Why keep wearing it when almost no one alive would recognize it? Elias looked at him, pale eyes calm under fluorescent light. Because symbols are not always worn to be seen. The room absorbed that. Then he added, "Sometimes they remind the one carrying them who he promised to be." Cole lowered his head once, a gesture deeper than apology. Nathan Thorne turned to the operators and his voice carried softly through the room. "Today you saw something no manual teaches. Skill may earn trust. Rank may command obedience. But humility is what keeps honor alive. No. One wrote it down. They did not need to. It would stay." Tom Keegan tapped the old photo. "Frame this one before one of us forgets where we put it." Quiet laughter moved through the hall again, warm now. Even Frank, still clutching the mop handle near the kitchen doors, smiled as if he had stumbled into a chapel and somehow belonged there. Then something simple happened that made the moment complete. Cole reached to his own sleeve, removed his Delta unit patch, and placed it on the table beside Elias's challenge coin. No speech, no performance, just a silent offering. Reyes followed, then another operator and another until a small line of patches lay there like a bridge between generations. Elias looked at them in astonishment. "Now that," he said softly, "is unnecessary." Nathan Thorne shook his head. "No, that is memory choosing not to disappear." Outside, the rain stopped. The clouds began to thin over the base. Somewhere a helicopter passed far off, its distant rotor thrum folding strangely into the silence, like an echo from the photograph. At last command obligations could be delayed no longer. Aides approached. Vehicles waited. Time resumed. Tom picked up his cane. Elias folded the old photo carefully into his jacket pocket. Before leaving, Nathan Thorne turned once more to Cole Mercer. "Next time you meet a quiet old man wearing something you do not understand," he said, "ask before you judge." Cole answered, "Yes, sir." Hidden beneath it all, respect is rarely demanded. It is recognized, often too late, by those wise enough to look twice.